Hello, welcome to the BI Validator certification program by Datagaps. In this particular set of lessons, we'll be covering the various aspects of BI validation, including creation of source nodes, application of processing nodes to this particular source nodes, and of course, comparing data sets, reports against one another, and of course, comparing reports against one another and applying rules to them as well. The certification is aimed for people who want to familiarize themselves with the product and apply these particular set of validation use cases across multiple facets and dimensions. Let's get started with the very first aspect, which are the different types of sources and node systems present. I'll be quickly switching over to a webinar container, which is our definition for logical workspaces for isolation of these logical workspaces as well. Let's start with the discussion of creation of a test case. Here I've clicked on add data flow, and this is basically where we create all our test cases within our data flows itself. Each data flow could be a specific test case, but you can have multiple validations between each of them. Let's call this test 2 for now, and let's get started. Before we get started, let's take a quick moment on understanding how the application works on an overall perspective. We have multiple sources in our application, including JDBC connections, flat files, complex files, generic connections, APIs, Tableaus, and Power BI, and other tool sets. To create these connections, first we need to define them in our sources. That's what I've opened from our system within sources. To create a connection, all you have to do is go to our data source and select the data source you want to connect to and add the corresponding credentials to that. In a sandbox environment, you'll be provided a bunch of data sources by default. In this particular system, all you have to do is go in and test if the connection works. As you see, the credentials and other aspects have already been added for these connections, but if you want to define your very own, feel free to add them. In case of any questions and definitions with regards to these connections, feel free to raise a support ticket. Now, let's focus on BI connections specifically. The two BI tools we'll be focusing on in this certification will be Power BI and Tableau. The Power BI connection is pretty straightforward. All you need is the username, password, and the application ID for a master user type. In this case, the application ID is provided in the Azure portal for Power BI. It's basically an identification number to let Power BI trust the DataOps suite as an application to work with for integrations and scheduling and other automation systems. Alternatively, you can choose to work with the service principal. The main reason to use a service principal is that a master user is going to impersonate your set of users, and thus they will inherit any kind of restricted access that particular user might have. On the other hand, service principal basically acts as a super admin, thus ensuring that you are getting away without worrying about any kind of access or restricted access to reports or KPIs. That being said, one key aspect of validation is to ensure that you're validating your test cases and reports at a granular level. Now, we of course have this in terms of filters and other aspects, but it's also in terms of user groups. The main example here to use is that if you have a global report with restricted access based on regions, where in fact different regions have different user groups associated with them, if there is an error in one specific user group, but you choose to validate the entire report at a zoomed out level with unrestricted access, these errors are going to get ironed out. An example, if you're working with a LATAM user group, which has access only to the LATAM KPIs, and here there's a 10% mismatch between what the records should be versus what they are. This 10% record might be ironed up to a 2% record when you're looking at it from an overall perspective. This is where you can add security models. Here you can define permissions at a role and object level, and in a fashion define exactly how you want to define your roles. For further details on how exactly this works, feel free to connect to us directly or use our support portal. But once you have user roles defined in your BI systems, use those particular object IDs only. Here I'm using LATAM and Europe just to illustrate the example. These can be imported and exported as well to maintain some consistency throughout the entire multiple environment setup. Now let's move on to Tableau. Tableau connection is pretty straightforward as well. Why, if you want to go ahead with a typical username, password, or a token connection, you will have to add web login commands. These web login commands are a necessity due to Tableau's inherent nature of not allowing any REST APIs or JavaScript APIs to run without a personal login, and hence we have to do this. Alternatively, you can forego this entire process by choosing the authentication type of direct trust. This is our recommended way. And here, all you will need is the username, client ID, as well as the secret key and ID combination. The secret key and ID combination is provided within the Tableau admin section. For more details, feel free to reach out to us directly or go into the support portal or online help to find exactly where in Tableau you get these specific connections and these IDs. Once you define this connection within your system, and of course, one last aspect about Tableau that I missed is that if you're working with default connections or personal access token, you don't have to worry about creating the web login commands yourself. All you have to do is reach out to us and tell us exactly what type of login commands you work with. Is it an internal SSO? Is it a Google-based SSO, or if it's something specific? We have the templates ready for this. All you have to do is import them within your system. To illustrate how such a Tableau connection looks, let's open up our existing Tableau connection. And here you'll notice we have login commands that were imported directly. Remember, do not forget to test the particular source before saving it to ensure that the connection works. And of course, if you get a sandbox from our team, feel free to test the connections before using them to ensure that the connections work as intended. Going back to our sources, this is how we have, now that we have defined our sources, now we can choose to create them. I'm going to go through each and every source directly here itself. This involves, of course, our JDBC connections. So here, all your corresponding sources that you've added will be loaded, the JDBC ones. And all you have to do is select what connection you want to work with. And on the right, you have the metadata. This is the entire set of tables within the particular subschema you're working with. And along with that, you have a query builder and an OpenAI assistant to help you create these queries better. In this case, all I'm going to do is search for a very specific table, drag and drop it. In this particular way, I picked up my data set here. I can preview this data set. I can choose to define a row count as well. Of course, there's undo, redo, and a little amount of parameterization, which we'll come at later. But more importantly, if I want to run this particular node, I click on this button to run this node. And in this way, I've pulled data sets directly from my JDBC connection. That's part one. Now we are going to quickly cover up the other aspects as well with regards to files and of course our Power BI connections as well. Note that your JDBC connection could be any specific connection and you can define a number of connections as well. The reason we have a diagram system right here is to ensure that you can create any type of test case you want to create. We're not going to restrict you at any point. Now, currently, since the session is live, and we have the JDBC node run, we see there are about 18K records loaded within our system. And what this implies is that we won't have to rerun this node subsequently. And I'll elaborate more on this once we start processing these nodes. But for now, let's pick up a flat file. And we are not going to create a dependency. You see, if I click this as a dependency right here in the diagram, you will see that the file is going to run after JDBC connection. And of course, I can choose if I want to run it if this particular test case fails, or if this particular node pulling fails, or is always parsed and other aspects. So this definitely helps us define a lot of specific criteria as well and helpful when we want to run conditional clauses. For our use case, however, we will forego this. We want to ensure that we're working in parallel with our JDBC connection. Hence, we define this as no dependencies, and let's just call this as a flat file. Once again, you can define your connections to ADLS, to a Google Cloud, to a shared drive, and other aspects as well. Here, our example is limited to an AWS S3 CSV file. You get access to the entire subdirectory that you've defined in your source connection. And here, while you can parameterize the name as well, I'm just going to select a particular folder. And before I run, let me select a subfolder as well here. I can select a folder as well. I'm selecting a specific file here for this particular use case. And before I run, of course, I'm going to run it through a peer review. And before I run the actual node, I'm going to update my value to header value to true. And you have to do something specific if you're working with different types of CSV files. If you're working with a CSV file which is not comma delimited, but it's actually pipe delimited, you will have to update a delimiter right here, so on and so forth. And of course, update the encoding if needed. And now when I run this particular node, you will notice that our JDBC node is not rerunning. We are running only the flat file as for two reasons. Firstly, there's not a dependency between the JDBC connection and the flat file. They're supposed to run in parallel. So in theory, they will run in parallel. And here, because there's no dependency, the flat file does not wait for JDBC to finish. So in this particular way, we picked up files from our JDBC connection. We picked up files from our source file. And the same way we pick up files from other systems, but now let's pick up files from our Tableau and Power BI systems as well, starting with Power BI. Once again, I want to work everything in parallel right now, so I'm just going to remove a dependency to illustrate this further. I click on Power BI and select the connection that I want to work with. Then I click on Add Pages, and I have access to the different workspaces I usually will have access to. In this specific use case, I have access to just one workspace, and this is because we're working in the sandbox environment. Now I'm going to pick up TIM customer CSV itself, as that's the data sets we are working with. And now what you see is we are loading up the Power BI system itself. Now there is a reason why the Power BI icon pops in right here. The reason for that is quite straightforward. It's to illustrate that we are connecting to Power BI directly. And what that means is that when we are pulling out data sets, we are not pulling them by the sources of our Power BI, we are pulling them from Power BI directly. Let me talk a bit more about this. When you see these numbers pop in with regards to the KPIs and other charts, Power BI is actually going to generate these numbers dynamically. Each time you update a filter, each time these numbers are changing, each time you're refreshing your report, these data sets are being updated. Let me illustrate it in lifetime. See, as I'm shifting my filters, the numbers change. And the reason for this is, well, these filters affect these corresponding numbers, and Power BI in the backend is keeping track of these. So common certification or common documentation needed for any kind of visual, be it custom or default of Power BI, is that when you create these visuals, they need to have a data set associated with them that dynamically changes. We connect to that specific data set itself. And to illustrate what I mean, let me remove my filters. Let's focus on sum of yearly income by total children. You see, if I go into visuals, I can see all the KPIs that we were looking at earlier. I can select multiple KPIs and chart data as well within my system and choose to run it. But just to illustrate what we mean, let's pick up sum of yearly income by total children. And you see, we're working with 2659. If I go back to the report and change this filter, I've shifted my data sets, and the same is represented within my visuals as well. We're at 132 million. But if I go back to my visuals, you will see the exact number that we're looking for is 13159. This is the number generated by Power BI. And if I go into further details, if I want to say work with it from a dynamic perspective, so first I'll have to add a parameter here. So let's add a gender parameter. All right, so now I added a specific parameter here, and now let's go into the filters. So here are all the list of filters associated with the report page and visuals are present. Since there are no filters at my report level, I'll go to the page one right here. And there's one filter that we saw earlier. And what I can choose to do is change this dynamically. So right now we are working with the gender filter right here. And what I have to do is edit, apply my specific filter right here, customize it. Oops, apologies. Now I've applied the parameterized filters within my Power BI report. The tip of the iceberg. As you might imagine, if you can customize your filters to this degree, you can do a lot more from them, and that's true. But for now, let's stick to the basics, where right now I applied a Power BI filter. And let's continue. Our bookmark is basically ensuring that you're keeping track of the filters that you've selected right now. So right now I've selected these filters, and this is what will be used, but I'll be overriding them with the filters that I've defined at my page level right here. Now, when I run this particular node, you'll notice that we have applied the filters that we have defined on this Power BI report. And in the back end, we are going to authenticate our Power BI connection. We're going to launch a browser. We are going to log in. Then we're correspondingly going to open this report and download the corresponding data sets. We're working with the assumption that the filter that I've defined is actually correct. So again, there's a difference between male and M. So we'll have to be a little careful on that front. There we go. This particular data set has been updated. And if I go into snapshots, you will notice that we have actually applied the male filter here. That's why we have 134. And if I go back to my reports right there, oops, sorry, I think we applied the female filter. Give me a second. Let's see. Yes, we're working with, since they're working in design mode right now, that's what we're working in right now. M is being applied. In production mode, F will be applied, and that's what you will see. And as you see, gender applied is male right now because that's the filter we've applied. So in this way, we can pull data sets, multiple data sets actually out of Power BI. For this example, I've picked just one. If you want to pick up multiple, just go into visuals and select multiple visual data sets. There's no limitation on what the type of visual you're working with. It can be map data, it can be tooltips, box charts, any custom data sets as well, as long as it has a data set associated with it in the backend, which it usually is going to, because that's kind of a requirement from Power BI side. So we can work with that particular data set. And so here we have a Tableau connection. All you have to do is define the corresponding connection right there. Then click on Add View. And here you will see all the corresponding data sets and projects that this particular system has the access to. Once again, we pick up customer analysis, and from this point on, we just need to choose which page we're working in. So the reason we see this sign in message is because right now we are going to access embedded Tableau reports from our browser itself. Again, this is from a browser perspective, and this is there to let you define your use cases. When this particular test case runs in an automated fashion, you will not see this particular system right there. What you will actually see is an automated system where you won't see this particular system run. Instead, you will just see a running button. And I will showcase that when I actually run the window. You will see the only reason this comes up once again is because, as you will see now, we're working with embedded Tableau. And for working with embedded Tableau, we do need to have a proper login. So I picked up my corresponding. This is a very complex chart that we have. Multiple charts present, multiple visuals, KPIs. And similar to Power BI, all these KPIs are present within our worksheets itself. Each of these data sets are present from the get-go. And once again, if I apply some filter to this, so let's say we apply a filter of Alabama to all of this, the corresponding data sets are also being updated accordingly. And just like Power BI, if you want to say parameterize a set of filters and other aspects, you can parameterize them right here after defining what you would like to work with. So you can work with selected values, you can parameterize them to a great degree, or you can select all. So if you want to include multiple filters within them, all you have to do is let the system understand that this is a particular filter you would like to work with. So here I've now messed with basically two set of filters. Let's make sure we select us. And now if I get into filters, you'll notice that we have both of them present right here. The only reason to specify this is to ensure that you're working with only the filters you want to work with, not all the filters in a particular report. As you might imagine, in this case, we will be working with 20 filters within this single report. The final step, of course, is to ensure what is the exact data set you want to work with. And just to illustrate how the application works, let's pick up something a bit more complex. Let's pick up this particular chart, which actually has tooltips associated with them. And we're working with quantity city. So all you have to do is find that corresponding data set right here, and you're good to go. So now we can rename this data set, and we can do the same in Power BI as well. So let's preview this. And now we are kind of pulling these data sets live from our application itself. That's why we see these things coming in a processing moment. Now I run this particular node, and you'll see the same process repeat, except this time we won't see the manual login that we saw when we are trying to access the report. That's something that you only see while creating these test cases. So as we see, that's what's happening in the background. It's quite straightforward. It's similar to what we were seeing in Power BI. We launch a browser in our backend. We authenticate the corresponding report. Let's go back to execution. And then correspondingly, we open that report and then download the data sets after applying the set filters. Similar to Power BI, we can apply those dynamic filters, and the application does have provisions to ensure that these set of filters, if you have a combination of filters, say you have 6-7 filters and there are 20 combinations you want to run across those filters, you can iteratively run your test cases with that as well. We'll cover that towards the later part of this particular certification lesson. With that, we've covered most of our sources, and here in the results, if you go back to result, you'll see that yes, we have picked up that corresponding data set, and similar to Power BI, you can pick up multiple data sets as well. So with this, we cover our first aspect of our lesson, which is covering the sources within our application. And in the upcoming lessons, we'll of course work with how we process them, save them, and of course compare and run some test case validation with them. Thank you for your first lesson. See you in the next one.